In this video, I'll cover the first learning objective for Chapter 5, which covers the study of the self. In this chapter, we'll be considering aspects of the self that include the nature of self-concept and how we come to know ourselves through the process of becoming self-aware. The first learning objective is to describe what psychologists mean by the word self-concept, and then to be able to discuss how it develops. Perhaps one of the most famous people to study the self originally was William James. He talked about the self as being made up of our thoughts, primarily our beliefs about ourselves. He also referred to this as the known, or simply how you think of me, and your description of yourself. He also talked about the self as an active processor, meaning that you know things, you experience yourself as an I, as an actor in the world. So there's this awareness of a person, you, who processes information, who is cognitively aware. He also talked about the idea that this known aspect of the self, or the me-ness of being you, that's what our self-concept is made of. It's beliefs about our attributes, beliefs about our traits, our preferences, our goals, things like that. The knower aspect, the I, is what we call self-awareness. And it is this idea that you can reflect on what you're thinking and how you're thinking it. So you have this sense of being someone who is known and knowable. That's the me component. That's the self-concept. The knower aspect is the more active. You can be aware of, for example, you have a thought, it crosses your mind, and you think to yourself, that was not a very loving thought I just had about myself. That's self-awareness. Or perhaps you say something to someone and it was a very nice compliment, and you reflect on that and you say, I'm aware that I just said a nice thing and my friend feels better. That's self-awareness. These different aspects of the self combine to create a sense of our identity. So there's a part of the self that is kind of static. It's known. It's the kind of thing you would list out if I said, tell me about yourself. You would make a list of things, attributes, traits, likes, dislikes, and so on. What I wouldn't know is that underneath is the knower, the person who is actively making sense of the world around you, and that is aware that you are doing so. So combining those two things means that you have a sense of coherent identity. Now, there are cross-cultural differences in definitions of the self. I wouldn't argue that they are a clear dichotomy, but research in this area, we've already talked in previous chapters about independent and interdependent kinds of points of view, but this becomes really an important research topic in the context of self-concept, because we do see some pattern differences in the way people talk about themselves and experience themselves.
East-West difference. Well, generally, East-West differences can be understood by looking at the nature of the self. The self is much more individualistic and independent, by which we mean that who you are defined very much by what you have inside. Say, your opinions, your attitudes, your personality traits, which really define who you are. Now, this view of the self, no matter how natural it might seem, is very cultural, and it is very unique to what we call, say, Western culture, by which we mean North America to be sure, but some part of Europe, but particularly Western Northern Europe. Now, many other cultures and places even including some peoples in the United States, Asian Americans and so on, for example, do not really buy into this particular cultural view of the self, and instead relationship become very, very, very important. And so who you are is likely to be defined by who you are interacting with, how you are situated, located in a society or relationship. And of course, I like to add that this kind of thing exists in all cultures. So for example, you cannot be a professor without having the university, or you cannot be a parent without having a kids, and vice versa. So those relational views of the self are very pervasive and obviously, but Eastern cultures really extend the range of situations this kind of metaphor is applied. So oftentimes, workplace and business, those things are also, conceptualized in terms of those relational interdependent views.
So what he is talking about there is this broad classification of independent versus interdependent self, but he's very careful to explain that your perception of self is situated. It really depends on the environment that you're in. And that's really a core theme in all of social psychology, that context matters a great deal. So he's not saying that no cultural differences exist. What he's saying is that as we move through our social world, our situational context can modify the way we experience self. And culture is one of those critical situational variables. So in Western cultures, we tend to be more likely to perceive ourselves as independent. Now, there are differences based on gender identity. There are differences based on, in some cases, location within the culture, like physical location. But generally speaking, people in Western cultures, the US, Canada, Northern and Western Europe, tend to define themselves as quite independent. So this independent sense of self, and I found this graphic that, because I tend to be a very visual learner myself, you can see the self in the middle and the X's represent traits. That self, it may touch against the other elements like mother, father, or friend, and have a little more distance from friend, sibling, coworker. They're still separate. They are bounded. So the big circle around the self does not overlap with any of the other circles. So the assumption is that you have your own thoughts, your own feelings, your own actions. You are independent of other people. And that kind of goes along with cultural expectations that you are responsible for yourself, you are responsible for your behavior, and by extension, what other people see in your behavior is a reflection of what's inside of you in terms of your traits and attributes. So the definition of self is not porous, it is bounded. And the assumption is that people are not going to cross those boundaries. And crossing those boundaries would be seen as intrusive in many respects. So the cultural value is on independence and uniqueness. And there's also this really strong valuing of being true to self, meaning that when you are acting in the world, you're acting out who you are underneath, as opposed to being situationally determined. Now, the contrasting viewpoint is the interdependent view of self. And this is a bit more common in Asia, in parts of Africa, in parts of South America, although it really depends on the particular culture that you're talking about. Most of the research, as I've mentioned in previous chapters, is in Japan, China, in some cases India, a little less commonly in Eastern Europe. But what's found in some of these cultural contexts, particularly in Asia, is that the self has these intersecting overlapping components. So the self is perceived as having its own attributes. So the little X's inside the dotted line that surrounds the self, those are your personal traits. But you see these X's that are in common with all of the other people in your life. And they're seen as overlapping elements that connect you deeply to other people. And I don't mean that in the sense of, a committed relationship necessarily, but they're overlapping commonalities in how you view the world, in your sense of responsibility to that world, your sense of connection to other people in that world. So the interdependent view of self really involves defining yourself in terms of your relationships to other people. So whereas in the independent sense of self, if I were to ask you, tell me about yourself, you may start by talking very specifically about your attributes. I'm outgoing, I'm friendly, I'm athletic, whatever. You make a list of your traits. Now, you may pepper in there some of your connections, but in an interdependent context, such as in many parts of Asia, when people are asked, tell me about yourself, they often embed their initial responses in their connections. So I'm a daughter, I am a sister to 2 brothers, I work at this place, I have really close friends in these places, and so on. And they may even talk about attributes they share in common with these people, or experiences they have in common with these people. So the self is in many ways defined relationally, in terms of recognizing that your behavior is often determined by your context with these other people and how they are feeling. Connectedness and interdependence is more strongly valued in cultures where the interdependent self is more common. And independence is often seen as problematic, that this, investing oneself in being different, being unique, is seen as selfish and may even be defined as, in some respects, not being mentally healthy or not being mature. Now, when we think about these two, independent and interdependent, if you look at it through a gender lens, females, even in Western culture, tend to see themselves a bit more interdependently than do males in Western culture. And that's something that researchers have found a great deal of interest in, that within a culture, even in a highly independence-based culture like the United States, we do see differences in the ability to, or the comfort level in feeling able to express interdependence. In many ways, the feminine gender role kind of demands a high degree of interdependence, putting other people in front of yourself, modifying your expressions and your behavior to fit the situation and the demands that the situation makes of you. Males in American culture tend to feel less pressure to do that, and in fact feel more pressure to be independent. So it's not just cultural differences, but also differences based on a variety of different social variables within cultures that can determine how you experience the self. So what does the self do for us? Researchers identify, or theories identify, multiple possible functions of the self. Take a moment and think, what does having a self mean to me? And what we find when we really dig into that, and this is in part a philosophical question, but it's also an empirical question, what do we do with a sense of self? Self helps us to know who we are. It also helps us to exert a certain amount of self-control. The self-knowledge component, when if I ask you, tell me about yourself, you're going to respond to that with self-knowledge. The self-control component is, okay, you've had a bad day. How do you respond to that bad day? Sometimes I just need a glass of wine and a very large block of chocolate. I know something about my level of self-control, my ability to say or not say things in certain situations. Another aspect of the self is the ability to manage how you are seen by other people. And we call that impression management. And then finally, the self is sort of the mechanism by which we determine whether we like who we are. And that is called self-esteem. So that concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 5.1. In the next video, I'm actually going to break Learning Objective 5.2 into a couple of chunks because it is a fairly long section of the chapter, but we'll be looking at the concepts of introspection and asking the question, how do people actually, to what degree do people actually know themselves?